Hello and welcome to this virtual taster lecture from the School of Criminology here at the University of Leicester. My name's Sam King. I'm a lecturer in Criminology here at the University of Leicester, and I'm also the Director of Learning and Teaching for our degree programmes here. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be able to produce a virtual taster talk on a subject which is one that you would encounter if you came to the university to study criminology with us. Now, my main areas of research interest are around how and why we punish people who break the law, and whether or not this actually helps to keep society safer, and whether or not it helps those who offend to be rehabilitated and to become so-called law-abiding citizens in the future. And so I'm going to be using this taster talk to give a bit of an example of the kind of lectures that you would encounter if you were a student here at the University of Leicester. So I'm going to take you through today's virtual taster talk in order to give you a bit of an insight into what the material would be like that you would study and that you would learn about if you were to undertake a degree in criminology. And I'll give you a bit of an idea around how we deliver our learning and teaching here at the University of Leicester. So I'm going to be basing today's criminology taster talk on a subject that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and it's to use an example of somebody who may have broken the law and how we might address the issues of punishment and rehabilitation for that individual who's broken the law. I'm going to use a story that I think many of us will be familiar with, and that's the old tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I think most people will be familiar with this, but just to give a bit of a recap so that we ensure that all of us have an understanding of the key elements of the story that are relevant here, we might argue that a crime has taken place. We have three bears who own a property in a rural location, and they've returned home to find that their property has been disturbed and that potentially a burglary is in progress. They've identified that some of their porridge has been eaten, they've identified that a chair has been broken, and as it happens, they've actually found the suspect asleep in one of the beds in their house. The suspect has fled the scene, but if we were to extend the story a little bit further, perhaps the three bears have reported this crime to the police. They've suggested that a burglary has taken place. They might have even provided a description of the suspect, and the police would then investigate this crime. If we take the story even further still, let's imagine that Goldilocks, in this case, has been arrested. She's been arrested and charged on the suspicion of breaking into the property, stealing the porridge, breaking a chair within the property, and then fleeing the scene. We might assume so far in the story that this has caused significant distress to the victims, and in particular to the child whose bed it was that Goldilocks was found within. So let's imagine that Goldilocks has been arrested. Let's imagine that the police have charged her and that this particular case has been taken to court. So what would happen in this particular case, and what exactly is it that Goldilocks would be charged with? Well, in this particular instance, we would identify this as being a burglary, and it's a burglary which has taken place at somebody's home. So it's the burglary of a dwelling, and this is in contrast to the burglary of a commercial property. So it is possible to commit burglary against, for example, a shop. But this is very much a burglary that has taken place at somebody's home, and so it would be treated as such under the law. And this is actually found in the legislation of the Theft Act 1968, and more specifically Section 9 of that legislation. And that legislation states a person is guilty of burglary if he enters any building or part of a building as a trespasser and with intent to commit any such offence as is mentioned in subsection 2 below, or having entered any building or part of a building as a trespasser, he steals or attempts to steal anything in the building or that part of it, or inflicts or attempts to inflict on any person therein any grievous bodily harm. Now, the legislation's quite wordy, But if we were to break this down, we could look at the instance of the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, and we could deduce from that or conclude from the story that indeed Goldilocks has entered the building as a trespasser. The bears did not invite her in. She was not a welcome visitor. And we might also say that Goldilocks did indeed intend to steal something or to potentially inflict harm upon those individuals within the property. So we could say under the legislation that Goldilocks would indeed be charged with a burglary, and based on the evidence that we have available to us, we might conclude that Goldilocks would indeed be found guilty. So that's a brief summary of the story so far and how it might be extended further if we were to assume that a crime has actually taken place, and if that was then to be taken to a court, and if the individual were to be found guilty. Now, I said that my main research areas of interest are around the way that we punish people who break the law and what we try and do in order to ensure that they don't reoffend again in the future. So it's at this point, once somebody has been found guilty of a crime that they've committed, that my research interests would really come into play. And so the first thing that I would be interested in, or I would be concerned about in this particular case, is the type of punishment that the offender should receive. So we might now turn our attention to the question of what punishment Goldilocks should receive in this particular case. So we are assuming that Goldilocks has been found guilty in a court of law, and we're asking the question of what sentence Goldilocks should get. Now, sentencing practices do vary depending on whether the individual is a child or if the individual is an adult. And for the purposes of the rest of today's Taster Talk, I'm going to take the assumption that Goldilocks is actually an adult and that she just looks quite young for her age. So we're assuming that Goldilocks has committed this crime and that she's been found guilty. In reality, any burglary offence must be categorised according to the degree of harm and culpability involved. So what this basically means is the courts, after finding somebody guilty, have to determine the amount of harm that was caused by the individual committing that burglary and how responsible they were for committing that burglary. And you can see on the slide here there are actually 3 different categories that an offender can be placed within. Category 1 is the most serious and carries the most severe punishment. And that's because for somebody to be identified as a Category 1 burglary offender, they have to have demonstrated greater harm and higher culpability. Category 3 is the least serious and carries the most lenient punishment for a burglary offender. So what might be some of the factors that we would consider if we were trying to determine whether there is greater harm and higher culpability at the high end of the sentencing practice, or if there was lesser harm and lower culpability at the lower end of the sentencing practice? So some factors that might indicate greater harm might include things like damage to the property which causes a significant degree of loss to the victim, and that could be economic loss, or if it's something that's of sentimental or personal value. Greater harm can also include vandalism of the property, or indeed it can include the fact of whether or not the occupier is at home or returns home while the offender is present. We might also suggest that greater harm is caused if there is a degree of trauma to the victim beyond the normal inevitable consequence of intrusion and theft. Greater harm might also be in place if there is violence used or threatened against the victim. Lesser harm would be if nothing was stolen, or if the property that was stolen was only of very low value to the victim, whether that's economic, sentimental or personal value. We might also say there's been lesser harm in a burglary if there's limited damage or disturbance to the property. So what about culpability? Factors that indicate higher culpability might be if the victim or the premises were deliberately targeted. For example, if they're a particularly vulnerable homeowner. We might also suggest there's higher culpability if there's a lot of planning or organisation involved, or indeed there would be higher culpability if a knife or other weapon was carried as part of committing the burglary. Higher culpability can also occur if the individual is a member of a group or a gang. Lower culpability, on the other hand, might be if the offence was committed on impulse, with limited intrusion into the property, or if the offender was exploited by other people, or if the offender has some form of mental disorder or learning disability. So what the courts would do in this particular situation is they would consider the factors that are involved in the crime in relation to the particular offender and in relation to the burglary that they actually undertook. And what they would do is they would categorise the offender accordingly as to whether there was greater harm and higher culpability, or lesser harm and lower culpability. So let's think about this in terms of the case that we've got before us in relation to Goldilocks and the three bears. If we were to think about greater harm, then we might start by thinking about the fact that the bears did return home and they found the offender, in this case Goldilocks, still in their premises. So we know from the factors that indicate greater harm that this would be something that would most likely be taken into consideration. We also know from the details of the story that there was some damage to the property, and you'll recall that we've just looked at some of the factors that indicate greater harm, and vandalism to property is indeed one such factor. So bearing in mind that there might be a whole range of other things that we would consider, for the simplicity of today's Taster Talk, we might indicate that indeed, in this particular case, having found Goldilocks guilty of the crime of burglary, we would indicate that there is greater harm here. So what about lower culpability? Well, in this particular case, we might argue that there is evidence of lower culpability. There's nothing really to indicate that there is higher culpability in this case. We don't know for sure, but there's no indication that a knife or other weapon was found, for example, and we don't think that Goldilocks is the member of a group or gang, as we're illustrating on the images that are on this slide here today. So we might argue on the basis of the evidence that we have available to us that Goldilocks, in committing this crime of burglary and being found guilty, demonstrated lower culpability for this particular offence. Now, of course, in reality, there are a whole range of other factors that would be taken into consideration and that would feature in the sentencing decisions that would be made. But on the basis of the evidence that we have and the information that we have available to us from the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we could take some of this evidence and start to think about the type of punishment that Goldilocks should receive. So I return now to that idea about the way that we categorise burglary offenders depending on these kind of factors relating to greater harm and higher culpability, or lesser harm and lower culpability. So on this basis, perhaps you'd like to have a think for a moment, maybe pause the video for a minute or two and have a think about what type of punishment you think that Goldilocks should receive. I've indicated on the previous two slides that I think that there is evidence of greater harm and lower culpability, but perhaps you might think otherwise based on your knowledge of the particular story. So maybe have a think about the category that you would place Goldilocks into, and then maybe have a think about the type of punishment that you think Goldilocks should receive after you've decided what category she would be placed into. So as I've said, I believe that Goldilocks would be found guilty of burglary and that she would probably be considered a category 2 offender. But what does that mean in terms of the actual punishment or sentence that this offender would receive? Well, if it was a category 1 offence and the story had demonstrated greater harm and higher culpability, then the starting point for sentencing in that particular example would be 3 years in prison. And the courts would be given some leeway between the actual amount of time that would be spent in prison, and the range for that is between 2 and 6 years in prison. Category 3 is the most lenient punishment that can be given in this particular case, and that would be if there was lesser harm and lower culpability. And the starting point for sentencing an individual who is a Category 3 burglary offender would be a high-level community order. So it's almost certain that they would avoid prison. And the range for this would be between a low-level community order and a very short amount of time in prison. But most individuals who are identified as a Category 3 burglary offender would probably serve their sentence in the community. But I've suggested that Goldilocks is a Category 2 offender with greater harm and lower culpability. And the starting point for sentencing individuals in this particular case would be 1 year in prison. And the range of sentencing options available would be between a high-level community order and up to 2 years in prison. So on the basis of the evidence that we have from the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, and the assumptions that we've made as we've worked our way through today's Taster Talk, we might argue that Goldilocks would probably spend about a year in prison. Of course, with good behaviour, she would be released earlier than that. But there's another aspect that we might want to consider here that we've not looked at so far, and that's whether or not Goldilocks has any previous convictions. Because for a burglary offender, if from the age of 18 onwards an individual receives a third conviction for a burglary offence, then they automatically have to serve a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 years in prison. So we might want to think about the possibility that Goldilocks might be a repeat offender, and whether or not we should punish those individuals more severely. But what else can we do when we're trying to sentence individuals and we're trying to think about the types of punishment they should receive? We should probably also think about the way that we try and rehabilitate those individuals, and maybe try and reduce the likelihood that they're going to reoffend in the future. And we might want to question whether prison is the best place to try and achieve that rehabilitation. Or maybe offenders serving their sentences in the community might be more likely to be rehabilitated and reduce the chances of reoffending in the future. These are all complicated questions, and there's no right or wrong answer to these. And that's what makes criminology a really interesting subject to study, because we can discuss these ideas, we can take into consideration various factors, and we can think about what our opinions are in relation to a whole range of crimes and the impact that it has on society. In this particular example, we've been talking about a fictional case of a burglary offender and what type of punishment that individual should receive. But when we're studying criminology, we deal with issues in the real world. We think about the impact of actual offenders on victims and their communities and society at large. And we also think about how we should respond to those offenders as individuals. What's the most appropriate punishment? How should we try to rehabilitate people? What can we do to prevent crime from taking place in the first instance? These are all some of the questions that you would consider, and you would be encouraged to share your opinions on if you were to study criminology here at Leicester. So I want to finish off by saying thank you ever so much for listening to this virtual Taster Talk. I hope that in the few minutes that I've been talking about this subject, it's given you some ideas to think about and a way to think of what your opinions on punishment and rehabilitation might be. I'd really encourage you to get in touch with us if you've got any questions or queries, if there's anything you'd like to find out a little bit more about, or if you've got any questions about the course, the School of Criminology, or the university itself. So please do feel free to get in touch whenever you want, and you can see our school email address there, criminology@le.ac.uk. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope to see you soon.